Yes, yes. This is the Thames actually down here. Just this is the Thames River through Oxford. Yes. Yes, overall, I think COVAX is a really great global initiative because we don't know which vaccine will work. And by pooling both the funds, but also getting different partners to join, it means that there's likely to be a portfolio of different vaccines that countries will then be able to access. So I think it's a very good decision that we try and tackle this problem globally. And China is a very important part of the global sort of health network that can control this virus. Yes, no, absolutely. So obviously, having three or four vaccine or candidate vaccines is means that China will potentially have an effective vaccine that it can share with the world, which would be a really obviously a great sort of outcome. I suppose, though, of course, there are other vaccines that are being developed in other parts of the world, and through the COVAX initiative, it would mean that China, if the vaccines are either delayed or they are not as effective or they have a different profile of effectiveness in different groups, China will be able to use other vaccines potentially as part of this initiative. I think this is very important, and clearly access is important. And so having an affordable vaccine that can be used globally is going to be really key to actually controlling COVID. And I think unlike other medications, the infectious diseases and the global nature of COVID means that it is in everyone's interest that we get mass vaccination across the entire globe to eliminate or suppress the COVID virus rather than either each country or each person just looking after themselves. And look, I think joining the sort of COVAX initiatives is clearly, I think, an important part of China being part of this solving this problem globally, which is what we need to do here. So obviously in the US, they're in the midst of an election, and it will be interesting to see what happens after the election as to what path the US takes. But obviously, this being a global problem, there needs to be global solutions, and the US is clearly an important player here. So I think all of the world would want cooperation between large nations like China and the United States to try to solve this problem, not only with vaccines, but also more generally with our other initiatives to try and suppress and hopefully move towards elimination or a goal of elimination in the long term of COVID-19. Yeah, I mean, in general, I think these organisations, such as the WHO, need all countries to be participating. So yes, absolutely, I think that the US either potentially threatening to withdraw or is clearly not the way we need to go. Well, I do think, and there is going to be a real efforts across the world, I think, to think about how to control future infectious diseases. China can clearly play an important role. Obviously, the in terms of trying to both with surveillance, but also reducing perhaps some of the risks of infectious disease, future infectious diseases might emerge. So I do think both China, the US and other large nations, large and small nations, need to think globally to actually make sure that if there is another emerging infectious disease, whether it be another type of coronavirus or influenza, there will be a plan in place to actually tackle this at source and not let it become a pandemic like COVID-19. I mean, I, Yeah, I think there's obviously a lot of domestic politics in the US, and I think maybe there is obviously people who perceive mileage or candidates perceive mileage out of blaming other countries. I actually don't think that is really helpful at this stage to actually help us work together to tackle this virus. And so I think, but once the US election is over, hopefully there's a clear outcome that allows the world to move forward and work much more closely on this issue. Yes, so I think it's important to think about prioritizing within the country and obviously trying to think about what each country is trying to achieve. Obviously, one wants to protect vulnerable people, but also there are other important objectives, such as allowing the economy to function in a much more normal way. And so potentially also protecting, for example, workers in the transport industry that may be exposed to COVID or more likely to be exposed to COVID. So I think there needs to be a plan in China and in all countries to clearly prioritize groups. But it is important to have for China to have a discussion about what objectives it wants to achieve through vaccination, and then try to achieve that in the most efficient way and equitable way possible. I would hope so. I do think it is quite remarkable that the path China has taken, obviously, at the beginning of the year, the very tight lockdown that occurred in China. Everyone was surprised at the steps China took, but now it does seem to have paid off in terms of really suppressing the virus to a low level and allowing the economic activity to occur. And so China is the only country, I think, that is actually growing in the world, and that is obviously very important for the world, but also perhaps it offers a bit of a model for other countries. If we can suppress the virus to a low level, similarly, there can be economic benefits as well as obviously health benefits. Well, obviously there are. I mean, many countries have engaged in aid, and China has, and in aid, and I think that is a potentially important assistance to other countries. So I do think providing PPE, which China can produce, obviously in very sort of large numbers, PPE equipment, it is perhaps important and to sort of be able to allow other countries to access that either through aid or through having being able to purchase that PPE. It does seem we've got to tackle this virus globally and critically, rather than each country having to produce its own equipment and its own drugs, for example. Being able to trade seems to me a very important part of this, and also to recognise that richer countries also assist other poorer countries who are less able to tackle this virus. I don't have any reason to doubt. So I mean, I would expect, like all countries that who sign up to agreements, that they honour them. But let's see. But one would hope that all countries that sign up to these pledges honour these for for the good of the world. The UK government, I think, and many European governments are facing very difficult challenges because there's obviously a very large numbers of cases, although obviously there has been less deaths than in the first wave, although these may emerge in time. Obviously, there's a bit of a lag. So it's obvious that is very concerning. I do think the UK government faces difficult decisions between the degree to which it locks down across all of the country or to which it takes the current regional strategy. So these are very hard balance. It's a very hard balancing act. And I suppose the other issue is that how you well, there's a suppression strategy, but in the long run, what is the objective, particularly if there aren't effective vaccines to actually how do you to get the economy back and but also have the virus at a low level. So I think it is an ongoing it's an ongoing challenge for the UK government to deal with these, to try and balance these very competing demands at the moment. It's much more difficult, I think, decisions currently than a country like China that has really suppressed the virus. I suppose there are the countries have had obviously countries have taken different paths. I think there will be need to be an evaluation. One's got to say, and it's not only China but also countries like New Zealand and Australia have been very successful in suppressing the virus, and in the case of New Zealand, almost eliminate the virus. But there is obviously, other countries such as in Europe may find it difficult. For example, it's harder to close borders in some European countries than it is, say, for example, in a country like New Zealand. But that is, I think, something that the world does need to really come to terms with. I mean, certainly China, I think, and offers a successful model in terms of being able to suppress the virus to a very low level. I suppose, I mean, in both countries, they did have really tried very hard to eliminate the virus, and that perhaps has allowed an opening up of the economy afterwards. But there is perhaps a difficult there are difficult decisions to make, and it doesn't perhaps always work. Clearly, the UK tried a lockdown not as comprehensive as China. There was a suppression, but only for a time. And so I think now perhaps there has to be a bit of a re-evaluation. But yeah, these are not easy decisions for government. But I do think we can learn. One way we can learn as a government, as countries, is learn from each other as to what is successful. On these, I suppose there's a lot. I mean, in the UK, different governments are taking different paths, and obviously, both in Scotland and Wales, there's now, I think, a more comprehensive lockdowns, whereas in the UK, they're trying a regional strategy. It will be interesting to see how it plays out over the next few weeks, whether the UK will almost, it's likely to face similar decisions to having to go perhaps more uh, well, across the whole nation or of England, as opposed to these regional lockdowns. That seems to be the way it's going, but we will see over the next few weeks. Look, I think in terms of obviously in terms of the strategies, obviously testing is probably a very important component. And again, I think we can probably learn from countries like China that have adopted very large scale testing. Although in the UK, testing has increased, there are arguments about using mass testing, which is perhaps, if we don't have an effective vaccine, is one of the few ways I think we can effectively suppress the virus. Beyond that, I do think where the UK has excelled is in perhaps some of the research around new drugs, such as the recovery trial that was conducted here in Oxford, and in terms of looking at trying to look at effective treatments. Although unfortunately, there are relatively few treatments that appear to actually reduce mortality, although some have other benefits, such as reducing hospital length of stay. Yeah, these are. I mean, I think there. Again, I think there's a lot of interest because Sweden is one of the few countries that has taken quite a different path. I think the only other point that is important to make is that often there seems to be a lot of factors about the transmission of the virus that we don't fully understand. So it's very easy to look back and say governments where in countries where there has been successful control or suppression of the virus, saying that those policies must be effective, when it could also just be either a bit of luck or also other factors, for example, weather or humidity and other factors that are playing or assisting in transmission or the way people interact in these countries. So I do think one can read a little bit too much into the impact of policy on suppression, but this is something we do need to study and understand. These again, I think that I think most governments around the world have accepted there is going to be a very large, fiscal debt, and there's going to be governments are going to need to fund, both individuals in terms of people who are unemployed, but also try to help the economy get back on its feet, and this will be use large amounts of government funds. Of course, in the long run, there is a question about how one pays for pays back this debt, and this I think needs to be thought about, and doing that in an equitable way. Particularly, I do think is because the virus mainly impacts in terms of its very severe impact on older people. I do think there needs to be some thought about the equity of future generations and burden of this debt on future generations. But this is something I think we do need to have a discussion in all countries about to think about a way in which we will pay for this current debt, but also think about how we can protect each country for the future and stop or future pandemics. And that again will require additional government expenditure and new roles for government to help maintain and control future pandemics. No, I think having countries, richer countries, join COVAX and contribute in this way is very important. So I do think all countries should be trying to tackle this virus. It's a global problem. We should be coming together as a global community, and whether that be through the WHO or organisations like COVAX, I strongly support the UK government's involvement, but all governments' involvement in these sort of international bodies. Although, having said that, these bodies, I think, need to be accountable to governments and to the world, and they also need to be efficient in the way and equitable in the way they make decisions in the allocation of a vaccine or other measures to control COVID. I think that there needs to be no doubt reform and reflection in terms of, and I think what this pandemic has shown us is there needs to be a much stronger global efforts to control a future pandemic, and that needs to be adequately funded, but also needs to be much more effective. So I'm not suggesting that things continue as they are, but I do think having large global bodies to fight global diseases like COVID or future flu pandemics or other emerging infectious diseases is going to be critical for the world. And what we have learned from COVID is the enormous cost of not having those systems in place. I mean, I think, well, it's useful always, to understand the origins of a disease, and particularly, I think if you're thinking about how to prevent the next disease, and obviously, for example, in much of Asia, the existence of wet markets that have both animals and humans in close proximity, clearly potentially a vector or a way that viruses can go across, can develop. But I would have to say, if it was me, I would prioritise trying to deal at this point with the COVID, and then have a look at some of the issues about the emergence of this virus. But I think more generally, think about how we might change behaviours and practices to prevent future pandemics. And I think China clearly should play a part in that, but also all other countries should be playing a part in that. It doesn't, I mean, it doesn't really matter where infectious diseases emerge. I think the critical point is we're trying to deal with them, but also trying to stop them occurring in future. I mean, it's probably not my area. I'm an economist, but in general, I would comment on perhaps trials. Is obviously it's important to evaluate vaccines via randomized trials. It's important, and clearly, all of the major vaccines are being subject to these rigorous trials, and they're looking at potential side effects, and also obviously whether they occur in the group allocated to the vaccine or the group allocated to another vaccine or the control group. But I do think the rigorous evaluation of drugs is a very important stage before they're put onto the market for people to use. And so I think all vaccines really do need a rigorous phase of testing. What do you mean? Right, right. It's an interesting question. I do think it needs to be either very affordable or it needs to be free and paid for by government. I don't think access should be an issue, and I think there are strong economic arguments to have the maximum number of people take the vaccine because obviously herd immunity means that if we have high levels of vaccine uptake, we're much less likely to have transmission, and I think that is pretty critical here. So, I would hope cost is not an issue, is not going to be an issue. But it's a little bit hard to if there is going to be a charge to work out exactly what that should be. And I think that is up to both governments within countries to work on that what they would see as fair and equitable. Although maybe it's also possible that governments might actually restrict private access. And I think one might argue, although normally in normal times, in many countries, including China, people can access private medicine. You could argue this is equivalent to a wartime situation, and there has historically been, for example, rationing in wartime, where people feel it is fair and equitable that everyone is subject to the same access, as opposed to having a feeling that perhaps rich people or can afford to get themselves vaccinated, and those on lower incomes must wait. I think that could be very problematic for many countries. So I think it is something that countries should be thinking about now before the vaccine arrives. Let's wait and see, but I would hope so. That I think there needs to be. I think there will be if Joe Biden wins. There will be much more global engagement. I would have to look at his specific statements on working with China or engagement in the WHO. But my feeling is that there would be a significant change in US policy if there was a change in the US president following the election. No, I think that's probably fine. It was pretty comprehensive. So anyway, so where would it be broadcast? Is this on this is on China sort of television, or is it a yes? Right. Okay. Okay. Right. Okay. 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 I mean, I've actually been to China quite a few times and also or tried or had been collaborated with Chinese researchers, including had quite a few discussions with China CDC, for example. But anyway, it's kind of, I mean, I, yeah, very much have in the past sort of tried to build links, although mainly in diabetes and other chronic diseases. And maybe sometime in the future, I'm happy to talk about some of the problem or issues China faces in its tackling chronic diseases that are a big issue, and maybe also smoking, which again is a very big issue in China. So but anyway, I'd be happy to. If you could send me the links, if you're going to use these clips, if you just send me the links, I can. It would just be very helpful to know or to be able to. And yeah, no, interesting questions. So take care. Yeah, yeah, no problem. Take care.